For a moment in 2019, it felt like something was changing. Around the world, millions took to the streets demanding climate action. At last, it felt like the disconnect between the science and our politics was starting to narrow. But 7 years on, we find ourselves in a much darker political moment. Not only do emissions continue to rise, but so too does a far-right, authoritarian politics that is committed to extraction. Climate change is no longer some distant possibility, but a reality of everyday life. So today, the climate movement faces a tough question. How do we balance the need for urgent action to disrupt emissions with the slow political work of building deep political power to transform society? In other words, how do we break out of this moment that we're in and build a climate movement that wins? Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai. Welcome to this episode of Undercurrents, brought to you by Public Interest. My name is Ollie Neas, and this week on the show, to answer these very difficult but very important questions, are two very important guests. First, India Logan-Riley. India is a climate activist with a long involvement in movements for climate justice and Indigenous sovereignty, a co-founder of the youth climate movement Te Aotearoa and a former climate justice organiser at Action Station. India now works as a project manager and policy lead with Tai Tawhito Tai Te Pua, an initiative focused on climate justice and constitutional transformation. Also with us, we have Simon Wilson, a journalist and columnist whose writing, which has been published pretty much everywhere, Metro, The Herald, The Spin-Off, The Listener, everywhere else, has focused extensively on climate politics, urbanism, and social change in Aotearoa. Welcome to the show, both. I want to start by turning back the clock to 2019. Here in New Zealand that year, we had around 170,000 people join the school strikes out in the streets. And in government, we had a Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who had declared climate change to be our generation's nuclear-free moment. Her government passed the Zero Carbon Act that year. It felt like we were turning a corner. Looking back now, 7 years on, how do you feel about where we're at?
If you look back to the School Strike for Climate movement of 2019, there was an enormous march in September. Something like 3.5% of the whole population was out on the streets. It was calculated. That is really big, and it was very exciting, and it looked like a whole lot was going to change. And then COVID came along, and I don't think we should underestimate the deep significance of what COVID disrupted. It disrupted everything in society. It made everything harder for us to pick up and get back again. It fractured society in so many ways, and it made individuals in all sorts of areas, whether you're sitting in your car and being an angrier driver, or whether you're trying to belong to a community group, all of those things have become harder to do, and that's something that we're all wrestling with in all sorts of areas. So that's the first factor. There's just a big mountain to climb now. The second one is that the very success of the climate movement before COVID had a couple of things in it that also undermined it. And I think one of the key things there was that there was a sense of complacency, particularly among my generation. It was very common for people to think the kids are going to save us. Look at young people, how exciting it is that they're doing all this work, and that's fabulous. They will save the world. This is a really dangerous idea for older people to have. We're part of why we're in this mess. We're a big part of why we're in this mess, and we have a responsibility to play our part to solve it. And it also puts an intolerable burden on young people to expect that they're going to save the world. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to be repeatedly told that when you don't have the power that the people who are telling you actually have, and you're not doing the damage that the people who tell you that are actually doing. So that's something that I hope we can see a lot less of. One of the other problems pre-COVID was, if you look at the schools, any school movement, I know this from way back when I was at school, we had student protest movements for all sorts of things. Because of the nature of being at school, the leadership will be temporary. It just keeps on turning over and over and over, and COVID exacerbated that because the leadership left school, and wasn't replaced because of the situation in schools. And so that became much harder. And then there are a couple of other larger factors operating now in society. One is the depressed economic situation we have means that so many people are focused more narrowly. That it's all very well to say that climate is a magnifier of every other problem in society. That's perfectly true, but people don't see it that way. The climate movement gets characterised as a nice to have, as something you can worry about when we stop worried about the cost of living. Now, so that's a real problem. And the other one, which is really big, is that the climate movement's not just up against reactionary forces and sort of dark powers away over there somewhere. There is a concerted, coordinated, and very active movement led by the fossil fuel companies and all their fellow travellers and all their enablers who are, in my view, see themselves as being in an end game. I think they know much better than the general population that we have two choices in front of us. One of them is to keep on using fossil fuels and damn the consequences, and the other one is to stop using fossil fuels. And because they know that they are fighting for their survival, and they're therefore very serious about it, very committed to it, and working in so many ways to make sure they do survive. And they are very rich, they are very powerful, and they are very active. So that's a thing we face now that we possibly didn't face 10 years ago.
I truly just hope that those who attended the strikes in the previous decade do not feel disheartened or feel that their work did not matter in that moment, because it truly does matter. It truly matters that we had whole generations of young people say, hey, we want hope in our future, and we demand that. It's really now about, I guess, the intergenerational work of making sure that we can achieve that. Yeah.
What do you see as the legacy of that movement, or what can we point to today as something that was achieved by those movements?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a larger question about change-making work in general. It's so hard to quantify in terms of saying, well, we won this, particularly because the striking is the doing. Really what we need to look at is the demands that these strikers were advocating for, like meaningful investment in renewable energy, the offshore oil and gas ban, which we did win for a moment until this government got rid of it. And so I think that's the important thing, is like change making is an art, and it is never done with just one tactic over and over and over again. And I think you even see that with the original instigator of this strike movement as we currently know it in terms of school striking, which is Greta. And how quickly she pivoted to, and we're going to do direct action, and we're going to articulate what is wrong with the current system, and we're going to point to economics as the barrier, or capitalist economics as the barrier to meaningful climate action, and all of those kinds of things. I think that's what I love about working with young people, is the minds are very quick to assess, this isn't working, this isn't getting what we're needing, so we're going to change tactics and we're going to dig into this a bit more. And in terms of, my experience in the climate movement space, working with young people, they were way quicker to understand the necessity of te tiriti in climate action and how important te tiriti or waitangi is for that, for structuring the response to climate change and to reducing emissions. And that, I think, is part of the legacy of these young people who truly get what intersectional climate action means, and that no one can be left behind.
I'm keen to talk briefly about this current government. So there's no doubt that it's embraced a more extraction-friendly agenda. As you alluded to, India, it's repealed the offshore oil and gas exploration ban. Then there's its fast-track legislation that's designed explicitly to accelerate mining, among other things. And I suppose more generally, Shane Jones, as the Resources Minister, has been very forthright in promoting mining interests, very dismissive of environmental concerns. And yet we do still have the Zero Carbon Act. The government still formally supports the Paris Agreement. We still have, targets of net zero by 2050. So to what extent has this government reversed the progress made under the previous government? How far back has this government actually taken us, Simon?
I think they've taken us a long way back. Specifically in the rollback of legislation, the oil and gas ban is kind of a spearhead, but we see it across the transition to electricity and transport. We can see it in a continuing rollout of exploration, mining in all sorts of ways, not just the offshore ban that Labor and the Greens put in place. We can see it in the continued rollout of dairy, industrial dairy, and the really big way in which so many ministers have done their best to persuade us that actually, we've got the emissions trading scheme and we are going to build some wind farms and therefore it's all okay. And you don't need to worry. And all those people who are telling you should worry and should do more, they're just irrelevant and they're just wrong. There is that concerted attempt to change the cultural landscape, if you like, to change the general understanding in society. And I think that's a really big difference that we have now. I think it's fair to say that when Jacinda Ardern said this climate will be our nuclear free moment, that was clearly hyperbole, and that clearly led to disappointment. But at the same time, it did actually allow everybody to understand that we're part of something. And it became an invitation to activists and to movements and to lobbyists and to other politicians and everybody to recognise that this thing does exist, we are part of it. So that's been undermined really significantly as well. There's a really big gap now between the centre-left and the centre-right in politics on climate. While it's true that Labour and National are both the same kind of neoliberal parties, the way in which they face is their backs to each other. They are facing different ways on climate. And it means that the choice we have coming into this election on this issue is very big.
Yeah, I think there's something there in terms of like what I see with this current government, obviously a rollback of so many things, including offshore oil and gas ban, the EV subsidy, all these sorts of things, which we could, argue about whether they were going to work effectively or not, particularly when it comes to things like EVs, it's still inaccessible to poorer communities and that kind of thing. But I think what we can see though is, and we can kind of look at Three Waters as a huge moment in which racism was deployed to ensure access to profit by private companies. And I think that's really important, is the repeal of Three Waters was laying the groundwork for central government say, hey, we're taking our hands off water infrastructure, we're taking our hands off funding that, we're going to open it up for public-private partnerships or for asset management companies to come in. I think that's something that we're seeing even in the climate space now, that, as Simon said, there's little solar projects and stuff like that are being permitted and that kind of thing. But we also just saw in the last couple of weeks a huge announcement around the opening up of carbon markets and carbon credits and the potential for geoengineering companies to be able to bring credits to market. And so I think they're very much in the game of how to create more commodities for people to be able to build wealth of. And that's a small group of people, I want to make really clear. That wealth doesn't get redistributed. That wealth doesn't come back into, say, paying for climate resilient infrastructure and that kind of thing, and helping us actually move forward as a community. I think that was also we talk about COVID. There was this moment there actually where we were being invited to think about ourselves and our communities differently. And as much as there was division, there was also huge coming together and cooperation to help keep each other healthy. The kinds of language and narrative that was being used by the Ardern government to kind of try and trigger a sense of collective obligation to each other was quite phenomenal, but that was hard to take seriously when there were also people losing jobs, rents going up, food costs are going up, and there was very little being done at a systemic level and at a social welfare system level to help address that meaningfully. And so I think that's the thing, is there was almost a moment, and I really want to recognize communities that I have ties to, particularly rural Māori communities, who are like, nah, we're going to do this and we're going to do it right and we're going to tackle COVID right and we're going to take care of each other. But not quite kind of consistently across the systematic level. And then we kind of almost see that with this current government as well. So long as we can keep making commodities, then then we'll do the climate action. But if it's going to get in the way of that access to privatisation, then we're not going to let it happen, and the pin's going to get pulled out. And so that's why it seems inconsistent, but I think the ideology under it is actually quite clear.
I think there's something else too that we did have it with the previous government, particularly ironically the coalition government of Jacinda Ardern's first term. There was the development of an economic structure of transition. So in Taranaki, for example, there were serious initiatives to rebuild and transition the Taranaki economy away from fossil fuels. There, in terms of the structure around electrification of transport, I know India raises a good issue about who was going to be the immediate beneficiaries of that, but the idea that the government as a state needs to lead and support this transition rather than just let the market do what it will, was in place. And that those things are really good, and they're a necessary part of a larger strategy, and they've been abandoned. So it's going to be hard to pick them up again. Because if there is a change of government, the new government's not going to have lots of money to throw around at all sorts of things. The dismantling of things that were working is going to be hard. But that's another way in which we have changed from what we were. We were a society that was embarked on a transition. Not fast enough by any means, but we were embarked on it. And we're that's much less so in an organised way now.
India, you were talking before about the ideology that I guess links together this government's approach to the climate and environmental politics. Some people out there would say, well, look, we might disagree on the solution here, but this government's serious about it. It's just a question of, policy debate about what's effective and what's not. I mean, do you think this government is just misguided about climate but serious about it? Or is its approach to climate, I suppose, purely rhetorical when it's got a different agenda? How do you make sense of that?
I mean, I do liken it. There are several fossil fuel companies out there in the world that identified like a net zero target back in the 2010s, right? They're like, we're going to do net zero by this time, or we're going to reduce our emissions 30% by whatever time, 2040 or something like that. And what we've seen over the last few years is those targets have been abandoned. And the rhetoric around that is, we don't think it really works. We want to do actual meaningful climate action, but then they're still applying to open up new gas fields and new coal mines and that kind of stuff. So I think it's, back when these targets were announced, there were folks who were like, oh, this is the indication of a change. And then there were those who were a bit more cynical, right? And then they have abandoned these targets. And so I think that's same with this government. They can say like, oh yeah, we care a lot, but actually the underneath, right? I got a notification this week that the 4th permit has been received for offshore oil and gas exploration since the ban has been lifted. And so if we're still opening up new oil and gas, then the rest of it does not matter in terms of this current government's rhetoric or any government's rhetoric. And I think that's really important here, is that whatever criteria we're going to hold this government to has to be applied to all the political parties.
I think also, Ollie, in relation to that question of whether the government is sincere but misguided or actually not, if there is a blue-green movement inside the government, let's hear from them. Because, there used to be, very clearly there used to be, but they appear to have almost nothing to say now. It is as if they've been told to shut up, and they can't do anything about it. So whether or not it's just rhetoric while they go on their merry way, or whether they do think they're doing the right thing or not, doesn't actually matter. They are misguided. They are getting it wrong in terms of climate action. And the blue-greens who ought to know better, the people who do actually declare they understand what's going on, are silent on it. And you think about all the issues inside this government where there are disparate voices. They do argue with each other a lot, but you're not hearing argument over this. It's a great shame.
The most recent development on this front is, of course, the announcement in recent weeks that the government would be amending climate laws to prevent companies from being sued over emissions. And the context here is there's been the Smith and Fonterra case, which has been working its way through the courts for some time, brought by Mike Smith, challenging various companies over their emissions. And this process was partway through, but the government has come in now and put an end to it. What was your reaction when you heard the news of that?
I frankly am scared about what that means and the kinds of social licenses that this government is trying to create, in which private individuals, whether even in the form of companies, cannot be held accountable for their actions that are harming other people. And so, you're not allowed to go and murder someone without consequences. You're not allowed to go and steal someone's stuff without consequences. Why should a company be allowed to risk the well-being of future generations without consequences? And so it's really disturbing. And again, to me, it makes me very worried about the fabric of our decision-making processes. And it's also quite reflective of what this current government has been doing, right? They've been closing down submission periods. They've been rushing things under urgency. There's a very heavy, non-consensual hand at the wheel right now in terms of this government. And it shouldn't be just environmentalists that should be concerned about this type of legislative approach. It should be everyone in Aotearoa, because it is not a good signal for how this government uses power and refuses accountability.
We've been here before, haven't we? Government's not liking what the courts are doing to uphold the rights of groups in society.
Yeah, and I think, we saw that with the foreshore and seabed.
Yeah, exactly.
The largest confiscation in New Zealand's modern history is government didn't like it and stole so much land from Māori, and that has had ongoing ripple effects and harm through the generations. I remember as a child being like, oh, well, in this society, people think it's okay to steal land from my people. And that was really disturbing. And has not been rectified to this day, right? Helen Clark refuses to front for it.
I think one of the pernicious ideas that took hold in New Zealand some time ago was the idea that there was a thing called judicial activism, and judicial activism by definition is wrong. In fact, what our courts do is interpret the law, and good judges, you expect, will be saying, actually, this is what the law says and this is what it really means, because whether or not MPs were smart enough to know this is what they were doing, this is what they did, this is what they decided is legal and illegal, right and wrong, permissible and not. We really need an ability of people like Mike Smith to be able to say, actually, we've got these laws, so surely they mean this, and to have that tested properly, not to have it just swept away by governments.
One reflection I had is that it also does reveal the limits of litigation as a political strategy as well. A lot of people, quite understandably, have put a lot of hope in you take your claim to court, and what you're doing there is you are appealing to judges, people in positions of authority, to see what's just and to act accordingly. But I suppose this is just a reminder that has to also be backed up by mass power out there to hold the government to account, because ultimately the government of the day can pass whatever laws it wants, regardless of whether that's right or wrong.
This is a global movement, though. This is happening in Britain and in Europe. There are dozens of people in America taking Donald Trump to court over his abrogation of climate responsibilities. Now, and of course, it's been happening in New Zealand for some time as well. And I think you're right, Ollie. If we were to put our faith in the law, we wouldn't get very far. But it is part of things. It is part of the larger strategy. And we have to do all the things, including this.
Yes. And I suppose the courts are not reliable friends. I mean, this morning I was reading a new article in The Guardian on a report on the sentences of imprisonment for climate and Palestine protesters there, talking about how extraordinarily long a lot of these sentences are in ways that don't flow inevitably from the laws that have been passed that show that judges are taking an unusually political and punitive approach here, which got me thinking. I'm keen to talk now about how the climate movement has evolved over the past decade or so. Now, India, you've been closely involved in the climate movement for much of this time. Was it 2015 you first went to the UN? Is that about right?
Yeah. I think I got started 2013, 2014. Yeah.
Right. So it's been a while. You've seen the movement change in a number of ways. What are your key reflections on where the movement was then versus where it is now in terms of its, I guess, outlook and approach?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it was an interesting experience coming into it as a young person. And I think that is the thing, and I mentioned it earlier, like when I first started, the relevance of intersectionality, the relevance of material hardship for frontline communities, the relevance of Te Tiriti was deeply questioned and critiqued by many people around me. But I think the needle has really moved on that internally within the movement. I think it's actually such a relief that now I can go in and say, okay, well, this Te Tiriti part is missing, right? This constitutional part of this campaign or this target is missing, and people will be like, oh yeah, okay, cool. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, that would have been like, oh, but no, we just need to reduce emissions and then we'll worry about the constitution. And so that has really changed, and I think the Zero Carbon Act also helped move the conversation along. We weren't arguing about whether climate change was real or not anymore. We're going, okay, how are we going to reduce emissions? We got to kind of leapfrog a little bit further. And at the same time, currently the movement doesn't necessarily have a uniting vision that we're all working towards, working within the system versus building a new system. We can do green capitalism. No, we can't. Like those kinds of debates are still had quite robustly. And also under this current government, having to be on the reactive and kind of the defense a lot of the time has taken a lot of the wind out of the aspirational sails to be able to really keep moving forward in terms of taking what the Zero Carbon Act created and actually doing something with it. Yeah.
Simon, what about you? What are your reflections on how the climate movement has changed over the last decade from your vantage point as a journalist?
I think the big change is that it has become much more embedded in civil society. There's an understanding inside many corporates and many businesses that it's important, for example, to have your building be efficient. So major corporates in New Zealand now demand Green Star buildings, and that's what is built for them. This doesn't mean that we are wholesale transformed into low emissions society, but it does mean that in lots of ways people's understanding has broadened. I said earlier in this discussion that things are harder now because the enemy's stronger and more determined, and COVID disorganized everything. I think those things are true, but I think on the other hand, there is a general widespread feeling that actually we shouldn't be scared of climate policy. I think there's also a great deal of confusion about what the policy ought to be and what we should do and what we should personally do and where the real responsibility for change lies. But I do think that socially, generally now, people kind of get it. And India said before, we've moved on from denialism, or moved on from arguing with denialists, and I think that's true.
Simon, I thought it was interesting earlier in the conversation, one of your reflections was that a individual style focus on personal responsibility and consumption was quite pervasive still. I found it interesting because for me, one of my reflections from looking at the climate movement is that as a focus in the climate activism space appears to have receded. And I think even by the time of the school strike, Extinction Rebellion movement in 2019, to me that was also important because it showed a widespread recognition that the central demand had to be a political one. It couldn't be about people feeling guilty for not recycling enough or for catching a flight to go see your grandma in Dunedin or whatever, that there was people who are responsible for this, and they had names and they had PO boxes and they had, corporate offices on Queen Street. I'm not sure what you think of that, India. I mean, from within the climate movement, are there still remnants of a more individual responsibility mindset, or is that essentially banished now?
Yeah, I mean, I have a complicated relationship with that because the sense of guilt is strong. And I think that's because for me, in order to be able to live by the values that I was raised with, that you take care of each other, that you take care of the environment around you, that you give more than you receive, right? More like a generosity and a koha-based economy approach is, how we all be well and how we all thrive, means then, and I'm constantly plagued by this sense of trying to do the right individual actions, because that's how I try to grasp living by Māori values and living by those relational obligations that I was raised with. And at the same time, also recognizing that if it's more expensive to do the more sustainable thing, then we have a systemic problem. And I think that's a really important thing here, is that there's no way that we get through the climate crisis without our lifestyles changing. But we can do those lifestyles change at a systemic level to make sure that we're still then able to live good lives with each other in community and with meaning and with joy. I think that's a really important thing here, is that through the transformation, our lives can be better. Our lives can be materially better off, and they should be. If we get this right, people should be better off. But the emphasis on the individual, of course, was pioneered and piloted by the fossil fuel industry to avoid responsibility. And development of the individual carbon footprint, the idea of recycling your way out, those were all very heavy-handed, rolled out by lobbyists to government and at a social level as well. And so I think there's complexity and nuance in that tension between individual action and, systemic change. But it is very clear that you can't have the individual change without the systemic change. And at the same time, we'll do our best, because every 0.001 degree of warming reduction really matters, especially for frontline communities, especially for those who are facing the brunt of the climate pollution and the extreme weather events. Anything that we can do is worth it, while also having our gaze towards the collective political action that we have to take.
I agree with all of that, and I especially agree with the notion that we have been encouraged to think the solution is in our hands, and if we're just better citizens, then the whole problem will go away, when our society has been organised for that to be really hard to do. And the obvious example is transport. We have a society organised around private motor vehicles, and therefore people have to use them far more than we would if we lived in differently organised societies. Having said that, it's still important for people to recognise there is an individual responsibility too. If you can leave the car at home, why not? As long as we don't say, actually, leave the car at home, eat less meat, and actually we'll all be fine. As long as you don't put a full stop at that point. But it is really important to keep trying to develop the awareness that if you need your car, it's probably because you live in a place where you had to live somewhere where cars were necessary. And that wasn't your choice. That was something put on you. And we need societal change to make a difference to that.
Now, before we continue, a brief note from me. We have big plans for public interest to build a thriving and resilient media platform for New Zealand, grounded in a commitment to democratic and egalitarian change. But the only way we can make that happen is with your support. So please consider subscribing not just to this podcast feed, but also on our website at publicinterest.nz, so you can get our latest content sent straight to your inbox. Back to the conversation. We've talked about the shift from a politics focused on individual responsibility primarily to one that recognises the structural obstacles to change. And that clearly fed into movements like Extinction Rebellion, which was very large around the turn of the decade. Each of these waves has carried with it a different theory of change, I suppose, a different view of the world, how the world works, how power works, and therefore how you go about changing it. Now, Extinction Rebellion was interesting because some of the key people involved spelled out exactly what their theory was, and it was about mass civil disobedience, you turn out large numbers of people onto the streets. And the idea was that if you get enough people, history shows that that will lead to big, significant changes. It was also about bearing moral witness to the horrors that were unfolding. But that view has come under criticism, though, from some quarters. And I'm thinking particularly of, I'm not sure if either of you have read any of Andreas Malm's work, the Swedish activist. And I suppose his...
Both have.
And it's provocative, isn't it?
Yeah.
And his critique was, well, part of the Extinction Rebellion theory rested on a slightly misplaced reading of how changes happened in history. If we look at the civil rights movement, if we look at the suffragettes, there was always a more radical flank taking more direct action. And his essential claim was that we need to be accompanying mass movements with more targeted kinds of direct action that materially disrupt the infrastructure of emissions. And I think that's clearly fed in some ways into the wave we've seen since 2019, where we've seen more militant direct action. In the UK, you've got Just Stop Oil. In New Zealand, you've had Restore Passenger Rail, Climate Liberation, Aotearoa, groups taking all kinds of forms of direct action, whether that's blocking roads or occupying mining sites, for example. Now, I think at times Andreas Malm himself has been critical of some of these movements for specific reasons, but I'm curious in your reflections on whether or not you agree with that critique of the Extinction Rebellion era of protest.
There were layers to the critique towards Extinction Rebellion, I think particularly in countries in which there was a racialized dimension to inequality and the building of that nation state as well. And so there were internal schisms as well as to whether, like racial justice mattered in the US or if it was just something to get to later. But I think, yeah, as you said, it does take a range of tactics and it does require a movement to be coordinated. I think we are in an era where we do look at each other's tactics and rip them apart quite publicly, rather than having in-person spaces where we get to hash out strategy and theory. And so I think it is those kinds of things also need to be matched with a process of rigor when it comes to reflecting on did that work, who did that impact, let's hear the voices, let's refine our strategy. At the same time, popular opinion isn't the only measure of a campaign's success. We think about Martin Luther King Jr., he was one of the least popular people in America at the time when they were doing these big marches, but we remember that differently. We like to remember a story of everyone was on the side of justice, but that's actually usually not the case. And so I think that's part of the tensions here is how do we bring everyone along and also know that sometimes there will be unpopular tactics. And we're in the change moment now. And that's what I really want to say. Hindsight 2020 is great. And we'll be able to say that worked, that didn't. But right now we're in the thick of trying to turn the ship. And so that always results in movements having tensions and disagreements. You read any history of any social change. Disagreement is part of the heart of the work, and that's how we do better.
India, you mentioned before people forgetting about how unpopular these heroic figures from history are. In recent years, I think it was a Steinlager ad campaign, or maybe it was Heineken, and it was about how Kiwi Steinlager is, and it had the nuclear-free protesters in the water. It had the Springbok tour, and it's like, dude,
weird.
Those were hugely divisive issues. They weren't unified at the time, but I suppose it's a testament to their success, right? Is that you had the anti-Springbok tour movement started out as quite unpopular. It was a minority movement, but over years and years of campaigning, it became a mainstream popular movement.
Jim Bolger, who was in Muldoon's government, meeting Nelson Mandela and implicitly taking credit for New Zealand's brave anti-apartheid stance, yeah.
Well, I suppose the listeners to Christopher Luxon or any future Prime Minister, if you want to, enact some climate action and claim credit for it, by all means take the credit as long as you actually do something.
I think it's also important that we have all of the things, that we're doing everything and we're doing it all of the time. If you go all the way back to the Save Manapuri campaign, which was the late 60s, early 70s, that was a very big mass movement, really enormous. And mass movement back in those days was partly based on a petition. It was sort of a naive, a quieter time, but a very big mass movement and then a change of government. And one of the first things that the Norman Kirk government did was change the position of the previous national government. And so Manapuri was saved. You need that political action. You need people who are going to go into politics and be in Parliament and change the laws to make things better. But you also need the mass movement. If you think about the anti-nuclear movement, the people on kayaks and surfboards and small boats who risked their lives to get in front of visiting American warships, very visible protest, captured the hearts and minds of so many people. Those things are really valuable. In the Springbok tour, mass movements, but also the guy who flew a plane over Eden Park and dropped flower bombs, defining moment for the whole campaign, very memorable. He went to jail, but he was a hero. You need that whole range of activity. And I think one of the things to remember in all of this, and it happened during the occupation of the buckets at Stockton, is that whatever protesters do, if it looks like it's being effective or disruptive, they're going to get vilified by the people they're protesting against. They're going to be told that they're being violent when they're not. They're going to be told that they're outrageous and saboteurs when actually what they're doing is exercising their legal rights. And even if they are breaking the law, if they are doing it in the way that those guys, those people did in the Stockton buckets, that is fantastic, because that galvanizes public sensibility, and it's something you can build on.
The difficult tension with the climate movement now is what I started out with. And I don't want to overstate this because I think these things can be reconciled, but there is a tension there of a kind between the need for direct action of the kind Andreas Malm is calling for, disrupting the infrastructure of emissions. And that's the kind of thing we've seen with with some of the occupations down on Denniston. But that also needs to be paired, doesn't it, with building mass movements that include people that right now might be skeptical of climate action for whatever reason. And I think the example on the West Coast is a really important and interesting one, precisely because I think the way forward isn't super obvious, precisely because I don't think there's an easy way out of it. There was an interesting piece about it in the Labour History Bulletin by Paul Maunder, the Blackpool resident and playwright, who described, I guess, a series of community meetings around the future of the mine down there, the Bathurst mine, which unions were participating in, which the management of the mine was participating in, as well as some Green MPs and activists. And in his view, the decision to go ahead with the occupation, I suppose, undercut some of the work that was begun there. And I just want to read out his description of the complexity of interests at stake here, because I think it captures the challenge. So he says, in summary, a pro-union company rationalising coal production while funding local infrastructure, a union aware of the crisis but facing worker denial, a Green Party which is anti-mining yet pro-union and unable to risk its urban support base, activists taking direct action out of urgency and risking a populist backlash, a mayor focused on climate resilience and fiscal realism, and mana whenua supportive of the mining company. All this unfolds on whenua seen by locals as their working backyard and by urban New Zealanders as a national treasure, and this whenua ultimately is part of the commons. So it's messy, isn't it? And I suppose we might have different views as to the specifics of that scenario, but India, is someone who has spent time in all kinds of communities working through this question of just transition, what in practical terms can we be doing to align these interests that can seem totally divergent at first?
Yeah, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, my God.
You could save the world.
I would have done it already. But no, I think about it, in my previous role, I was working for the Pacific Network on Globalization, and we're doing quite critical work assessing the claims of carbon markets in the Pacific. There's this woman, Frances, who works for the Pacific Conference of Churches, and she said, our job is not to condemn, these communities on the ground. Our job is to walk alongside them. And I think about that a lot, right? Because we're spending time with people who come from communities who are involved in carbon speculation at the moment. And so that's the important thing here, is that with these communities, they are facing a really tough set of economic circumstances. And there can be no progress on that without communities being able to come together and a government who's ready and willing to reckon with the long-term decisions and conversations that we need to have, being able to, over a long period of time, come in, say, sit around the mat, sit under the wharenui and say, hey, you need that. Your family needs a house. Your family needs food. How can we make sure that happens and also not have to do mining? And that's a really hard thing with like a 3-year political cycle, is you'll get people who show up for votes and to get re-elected, but they're not necessarily there on the ground, facing those hard conversations every day. And that's not to cast aspersions on a particular political party. That's just kind of the nature of the relationship between those that we elect and those who live within the community. And those are really fraught situations. And that's where I say, like, we definitely shouldn't be expanding mining. And at the same time, we have a social welfare system that does not enable people to be able to transition easily or well or with dignity, and to be able to keep their families well and healthy. And that's the nugget that I think is we're starting to see activists and movement spaces move towards that. And we're starting to see some politicians move towards these really long, meaningful relationships. And that's like the power of the Māori approach to relationships, is we will show up and we will keep doing this and we will keep talking about it and we will figure this out, because moving at the paces of relationship is going to get us the change that we need. But then, we have these like short, sharp, where's the quickest buck treatments that ultimately end up undermining those relationships that we need to be able to have these really tough conversations. And that's the complexity of it.
It's not just that it's short, sharp, it's also that it's deeply embedded in the way in which the economy works. And this is a global phenomenon. If we start from the point that fossil fuels should be left in the ground, which all the science tells us is we have to do, then the question is, so how are we going to develop economic options that work for all the people that affects? And in some ways it's easy. If you're in Texas, you can build solar farms and wind farms, and they can replace the oil, and people can upskill and retrain, and it's a relatively straightforward process compared with the West Coast, where, 3% of the economy in Westport is tourism, but 25% is mining. That's a really big disparity, even though there has been a lot of effort put into tourism on the West Coast for decades. So it's not easy at all, but and it's not the miners' fault that they're mining. That's the only option they have, or as you say, India logging native forests, and we don't want that either. So it's not their fault, and they can't be abandoned. But the solution can't be, actually, this is too hard, we're just going to have to keep on mining. That's actually should not be one of the options available. And it's not that it's easy. And it requires, as India said, a lot of central planning, a lot of government commitment and corporate commitment as well, to solving the problems, and not just allowing the market or just giving up and saying, actually, there's no option.
Before we round this off, I want to turn just briefly to electoral politics. Now, a common gripe that we hear, usually from the right, I'd say, is that the Green Party would be more effective if it focused on environmental politics alone, climate politics alone, rather than a broader social and economic program. Well, I'm going to assume that both of you don't agree with that. But for those people listening who might think there's something in that, why is it important that climate politics is paired with a broader political program?
Who first?
Whoever feels the spirit pulling them.
I definitely feel the spirit pulling me on this one. I think it's astonishing that political parties are supposed to focus on what's important to New Zealanders, and we're told all the time that right now what's important is the cost of living. But somehow the Greens are meant to be exempt from that. They're not meant to focus on what people are feeling the most day by day. That's just an absurd idea. That's part of it. But the other part of it is that climate action and environmentalism in its wider front are not divorced from the economy. They are economic issues. We need to build an economy that will allow the country to operate sustainably and deliver prosperity to people. And I don't mean by that growth, but I do mean that people should have a decent standard of living and to be able to feel that their aspirations can be met. That is a society-wide goal, and it can't be done if we trash the environment, and it can't be done if we ignore the climate. So they're just inherently related, and it's only a political attack on the Greens to pretend that somehow they should be focused on saving the Kiwis and forget about everything else. That's extremely duplicitous.
Moana Jackson would talk about, if you look to the whakapapa of something, the solutions become clear. And I think about environmental degradation where I'm from, here in Hawke's Bay. The land was stolen and then it was felled and then the wetlands were drained and then all the things that are meant to keep carbon in the ground were destroyed for being able to create giant farms that only a few people make a profit from. And then Māori are displaced, right? Like we lost 80%, 80% of our land was stolen over about 7 years. And if you think about a population having everything that they used to build their houses to feed their people ripped away from them and then contaminated, and then you can kind of see quite clearly that the relationship between our economy, right, which is our resources, and the relationships with the ecosystems around us were disrupted and taken away. And then we're facing the brunt of these climate crises right now. And so I think it's a misunderstanding of environmental destruction to posit it as just a niche corner issue over here. They're deeply intertwined. The nature or kind of the social construct of how we think of our ecosystems, how we think of each other, how we think of economy, how we think of resources and taking care of each other is all intertwined. And that's where I think like a whakapapa relationship, right? We're so lucky to live in Aotearoa and have these kind of Māori legal frameworks that we can use to guide and instruct decision-making, because that will enable us to make better decisions, to make better and more intersectional decisions. Because as I said, like any climate policy that doesn't also alleviate material hardship isn't a good climate policy. And then, we talked a bit about how do we build popular support for climate action, and it really does sit at being able to embrace those intersectionalities at the heart of the work, because climate change isn't just an environmental issue. We know that from the history of it and how it came to be, that it isn't just an environmental issue. And so our political responses shouldn't also just be environmental issues.
I think the climate movement has a really big challenge in front of it right now, and the Green Party, as part of the climate movement, has a particular responsibility in it. We need a really big campaign. As it happens in New Zealand, we have a really good example of this being spectacularly successful very recently, and that's the Toitū Te Tiriti campaign. And the climate movement has things to learn from that. One of them, I think, is that there's a specific cause that we probably need to put up in front of people, so that it's not just we have to save the world or various ways of saying that, but actually we need this thing to happen. And I'm not sure what that is. We need a leader or leaders, someone or people who are prepared to be out front and become focal and command media attention. Those things are important. And we need political support behind it to ram the message home and to make the changes that are necessary. And probably we need a slogan too. Toitū Te Tiriti is profoundly influential as an idea. And, the climate movement needs its equivalent of that.
What is your message to people who are concerned about the climate, thinking ahead to November's election?
make sure everyone that you know is enrolled to vote, and then make sure they make it to the polling booth, that they have a plan. If they're not a member of a union, join a union, right? We have to use our worker power in this moment, and that's one of the best ways to resist the political changes that are being put to us. Whoever we elect this year will be in charge until 2029. Our emissions are meant to reduce by, I think, like 50% by 2030, and they're nowhere near that. And so there are these ways in which we can set ourselves up well, and to help contribute to the conditions of good climate action that is intersectional, if we put the votes in now, and if we put the activism in now, that will have ripple effects for the long run. And and the fruit of that, the evidence of that, is the ways in which we're talking about moments like nuclear free and Toitū Te Tiriti, these historical events that now we get to be in the place of helping to create for the next generation. And so that's where I'm like, this election can be make or break if we use it as such.
I also think it's worth stressing that protest works. That New Zealand would be covered in mines at the moment, mining, if it wasn't for mass protest actions, if it wasn't for the disruptive activities of people, if it wasn't for the advocacy groups, if it wasn't for the enormous amount of research and science that's gone into those causes, and if it wasn't for the politicians and political parties prepared to put a limit on it. That ecosystem is functional, and we have it intact here. We just need to be using it in a bigger way.
That's all we've got time for today. Thank you both, India and Simon, for your time. You've been listening to an episode of Undercurrents, brought to you by Public Interest. This episode was produced by Micah Geiringer and me, Ollie Neas. Theme music by Ben Locke. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more conversations and interviews making sense of politics and power in Aotearoa, please consider supporting us at publicinterest.nz. We'll see you next time.